done. And we're asking that everyone please, even if you're bilingual or English speaker, you should choose a language to ensure clear communication, and you may change your listening language at any time throughout the program. Now I'm going to say the same thing in Spanish. Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Le habla Vanessa y soy la intérprete en español junto con mi colega Erika. El evento del día de hoy se va a llevar a cabo en inglés, pero con interpretación en vivo al español. Si desea escuchar la interpretación al español en su computadora, haga clic en el icono del globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom y seleccione Spanish. Si se está uniendo a través de la aplicación Zoom en un dispositivo móvil, seleccione su idioma haciendo clic en More o en los 3 puntos en la esquina inferior derecha de la pantalla. Seleccione Language Interpretation, que es interpretación del idioma, luego elige Spanish y luego haga clic en Done. Listo. Y le pedimos a todos, incluso si nada más quiere escuchar en inglés o las personas que sean bilingües, les pedimos seleccionar un idioma para permitir una comunicación clara, y uno puede cambiar de canal para escuchar en otro idioma en cualquier momento del programa. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And I just want to welcome everyone again to Advocating for Survivor Services and Prevention, a Reliance webinar. We're so glad you could be with us today. And what a moment we're all here for. We are recording this webinar, just so you know. The recording will be available, and we've begun the recording. And we will hold questions till toward the end. Maureen Gallagher is going to be helping us with the chat, making sure she keeps track of your questions and comments, and she'll also be dropping a lot of useful links in the chat, so you might want to keep up with that as we go along. I'm Terry Poore. I'm the Policy Director of Reliance, and I'm so happy to be together here for survivors at this amazing moment. Things have been really, really hard for survivors and communities and ourselves during this past year, but at the same time, we know spring is coming, and policies and funding to support survivors are moving through Congress. So it's a great time to talk together, to get organized together, and to share our collective voices for survivors. So this is a perfect time to be here together. So hello, on behalf of your speakers today, as I introduce myself, I'm Terry Poore, the Policy Director of Reliance, joined today by Ellen Fern. She does government affairs for us, and she is with Bose Partners, Bose Public Affairs Group. But I want to say what she really is a ride or die anti-sexual assault advocate in her heart. She's been working in the anti-sexual violence movement for, my gosh, it's hard to do years now, right? I was just reflecting that I started at a local program, I think 26 or 7 years ago. And I know that you were instrumental in helping found the Sexual Assault Services Program back in 2005. So it's been at least that long. Yeah.
Still a professional high point for me, even though it's back in 2005.
But to get us started, I want to turn it over to a woman that I am very honored to call my close friend. She is an amazing leader and just an amazing activist, and she is a managing partner of Reliance, Monica Johnson Hostler, but she wears so many hats so well. She is also the president of the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. She's the executive director of the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And she is on the school board of Wake County. And like me, she comes directly from the field. And so we are so happy to be here with you today. And she is bringing greetings to you on behalf of the Reliance partners, Sandra Henriquez and Karen Baker being the other two partners.
Thank you, Terry. And of course, years are very difficult. So when you calculated your years to me yesterday, I realized, oh, wow, I literally have been in the movement over 25 years. I think I looked at my bio and it still says 20 years. So I think 5 years flew by somehow, somewhere. But it is indeed my pleasure to be joined by my esteemed colleagues and dear friends, as Terry noted. Both Terry Poore and Ellen Fern are both longtime, not just colleagues and activists, but they're really friends. And I feel like without a shadow of a doubt, I wouldn't be able to wear all of those hats if I didn't have amazing partners who did the day-to-day work and to make sure things are really happening in DC on behalf of all of our local sexual assault service providers, including our coalitions, local programs, culturally specific organizations, and survivors alike. So it is indeed my pleasure to join you today and welcome you on behalf of Reliance, which is a national partnership dedicated to ending sexual violence in one generation. The partnership is inclusive of the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and Calcasa Prevent Connect. And as you, Terry, noted, the three of us, both Sandra, Karen, and I, are the managing partners. And without a shadow of a doubt, it has been a pleasure to work alongside my colleagues as we partner with a wide range of organizations to improve their culture, create environments that are free from sexual harassment, sexual violence, and misconduct and abuse. Every day, the Reliance and all of our partners works to establish strong and safe communities. And we certainly do still reiterate that we feel like this work was really bold and innovative, and we do believe that prevention is possible. And so as we work towards creating the safe and violence-free communities that we hope to, we also know that our commitment has to be steadfast and strong in our policy work. And so we appreciate all of you who have been amazing advocates, supporters, those of you who've made phone calls, but more importantly, those of you who continue to support and work on behalf of survivors. And so again, it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Reliance, and I will turn it back over to you, Terry. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monica. And without further ado, I don't know why that line is on my screen. I'm going to try to figure that out. We're going to jump right in here. We're going to talk about what's in our toolkit, key issue updates, so you know exactly what's happening right now. We're going to give you a suggested timeline for setting up your virtual meetings with your members of Congress and their staff, do a little advocacy 101, talk some specifics about planning and conducting your meetings, and then leave you with some talking points and key asks. So we have a toolkit, and Maureen is going to drop the link to the toolkit on the Reliance website in the chat. All the stuff we're talking about, lots of detail in the toolkit about that, including templates that you can use, for example, to do your request for a meeting, to do your talking points. There are handouts, there's a congressional calendar, everything that you need, we think, to set up some meetings and hold meetings to really push for survivor services and prevention funding are available in this toolkit. So we really recommend that you use it and share it. So to jump right into a few key issue updates, and what a time we're doing this. This is a really remarkable time. Just moments before we started this webinar, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan. A lot of us have been calling it the ARP, which is really landmark legislation to really help our nation and the people of our country through this pandemic. So there are really major policy pieces in here, everything from unemployment insurance to support for local communities. But what we really want to highlight today is, in addition to that, some really important funding for relief funding for rape crisis centers. So there's $198 million for rape crisis centers. It's brand new. It just passed. It just, as you know, it just passed the House the final time yesterday, signed by the president today. So it's going to take a minute or two for us to think about administering how those funds are going to be administered through HHS, but really exciting money for FIPSA, almost $50 million for culturally specific programs, which we think is so important so that we really reach services into communities of color, money for our tribal partners, and money for the domestic violence hotline. So very, very exciting moment that we're all in, and good to know that some relief is coming for survivors. And then we have the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. The House bill was introduced just this Monday, HR 1620. We know it's a very high priority for our current president. It's moving quickly. We actually expect it to pass the full House next week. And it has some really important investments in sexual assault programs, some really important protections for vulnerable survivors. And so that is moving quickly. It's very exciting. And that's something you can talk about in your meetings, the importance of reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. Of course, by the time you have your meetings, it's possible that the House bill will have passed, but you can always talk about the importance of the Senate moving on it. What we know on the Senate side, unlike the American Rescue Plan, which was passed in a process called reconciliation, which you're likely following in the news, which only required a 50 vote margin to pass on both sides. the Violence Against Women Act on the Senate side is actually going to need 60 votes. So we're going to be all working hard together to make sure we've got 60 positive votes for legislation once it gets over there. The Violence Against Women Act has not been introduced in the Senate yet. So stay tuned for that. And then we have the very important Victims of Crime Act, Crime Victims Fund. And I know when I started at a rape crisis center back 26, 27 years ago, this was the funding source that funded my position. This is a non-taxpayer source of funding that supports almost all victim services across the country. Definitely sexual assault programs, definitely domestic violence programs, but more broadly than that, homicide survivor support groups, Mothers Against Drug Driving, a broad range of victim services. And the money comes from federal criminal cases prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice, so federal crimes. In the past, mostly on major convictions of white collar crime. And what we've noticed is that deposits have been significantly dwindling over the past 5 or 6 years. It's very, very concerning to the field, and which has meant significant cuts to the VOCA funds. Now, some states have felt that very directly and already feeling the pain of program cuts from VOCA. Some, because states can take a few years to spend that, some states haven't experienced that as deeply yet, but those cuts very unfortunately are coming. We do have several solutions, but one solution is called the VOCA Fix Act, which changes the types of money that can go into VOCA from just those monies from convictions to also monies from deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements. And what we know is there are a lot of cases that are being handled that way now. So we hope that once this passes, that will mean more money into the Crime Victims Fund, more services available for victims. So one of the things we're going to ask you to do is talk about the importance of the VOCA Fix Act, HR 1652 and S 611 in the Senate. Both bills were introduced with strong bipartisan support last week. Was it last week? Maybe 10 days ago now. It's all kind of going together. We hope that will move very quickly in the House, but we definitely need to be pressuring our members of Congress to support this and move it. It's really, really important. And for appropriations, on the appropriation side of it, we just really at this time of decreased deposits and real fear for the fund, we are hoping for steady funding in the appropriations process. So we talked about the ARP, the American Rescue Plan. We talked about Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. We talked about VOCA legislation. And I want to just touch on two key federal programs that are really, I think, the bookends of the services and prevention for sexual assault. So the first is the Sexual Assault Services Program, which is a formula grant. It means it goes out to all the states. As we said, Ellen was instrumental in helping create that, as was Monica back in 2005. And that funding goes to all the states and territories, culturally specific organizations and tribes to provide direct services to survivors of sexual assault. And we really prioritized this program. In FY21, we got an increase from 38 million to 41 million, largely as a result of a lot of you doing meetings like the types that we're talking about today. And we're asking for an increase to 100 million in that program because we know that survivors need better access to counseling and therapy. We know that according to our data, 62% of local programs have a waiting list for counseling, that over a third of programs don't have a full-time therapist on staff. So we know we really need this increase in sexual assault services program. And then along with services, we know that prevention is so important, and sort of the flagship sexual violence federal prevention program is the Rape Prevention and Education Program. We got a small increase in FY21 to $51.75 million. This is also a formula grant that goes out to states and territories through their health departments for sexual violence prevention. And we always hope gets down into the community to provide primary prevention of sexual violence in the community. And we have been doing advocacy through the Violence Against Women Act to require funded collaboration with state sexual assault coalitions, because we know the This program was the brainchild of state sexual assault coalitions. The founder of the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, Gail Burns-Smith, really came up with this idea as a back before people were talking about prevention in the mid-90s, to say that the country really needed to invest in sexual violence prevention. And so we know that it's so important that the expertise of the coalitions be at the table to make sure this program works really well and gets funding down to the community, where we know that community-based solutions are often the best for solving sexual violence. And in FY22, we're asking for an increase of RPE to 75 million. So we'll talk more about those issues as talking points a little later, but we did just want to give you some issue overviews so you know the lay of the land. And then Ellen's going to talk for a minute about member requests for appropriations priorities, and then we're going to really talk about how to set up your meetings.
Thanks, Terry. I asked Terry if I could do this slide because appropriations is my favorite thing to do, because that's getting the money. So every year, the one thing Congress has to do, come rain or come shine, is pass a budget. And so we are starting on our work for the fiscal year 2022 budget, which will start October 1st. And we're a little delayed this year, and which is often the case when a new president and a new administration comes to town, because there's lots of work to get every new staffers in place and to think about what a president is going to propose for a new fiscal year budget. And usually that process kicks off with the State of the Union address. That hasn't happened yet this year, but it will in probably the next 2 to 3 weeks. But obviously they wanted to get the American Rescue Plan passed and get some nominations passed. So we're a little delayed, but the appropriations process has begun. And most representatives and senators will accept specific requests from constituents, and they put their forms right on their websites for you to request where you want that member to prioritize his or her funding choices. And so you would go to we encourage you to go to your member's website, look for those forms, and Reliance has specific templates with the information you will need to put in these forms to make those requests Terry just outlined for SASP, RPE, and VOCA. And if you can't find the form on the website, you can just literally call them directly and ask where to find that form. And soon the process already in April will kick off with the House, and soon there'll be hearings held by each subcommittee about what is needed for next year's budget, and that's going to start in mid-April.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. So now we're going to dive into the nitty-gritty of how you can get going on setting up meetings with your members of Congress and your senators when they're at home for recess the last week in March and the first week in April, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so we're kicking it off today with this webinar. And then we ask next week for you to start making meeting requests. And we're going to talk to you all about how to do that. And then the following week to start gathering your materials, holding your prep meetings for attendees, practicing your talking points, getting all ready. And we'll talk to you about how to do that in just a second too. And then the last week in March and the first week in April, try to go ahead and schedule those meetings and hold those meetings. And then finally, the week after, a couple weeks after that, to send thank you notes, follow up, because we're going to talk about how important it is to build ongoing close relationship with your members of Congress. Great. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ellen to talk about some little Advocacy 101 pieces.
Right. First, often when one is asked to reach out to a congressional office, one can feel nervous. So here are some of my tips in terms of how to think about advocacy and how I think about it and why I actually like doing it and keep doing it. Because to me, effective advocacy is about education. It's like you're the best teacher ever, and the member of Congress and his or her staff are your students. And these are students that want to learn. They want to do the right thing. You might not always agree, but it's your job to educate them on the issues because you're the expert. No matter what, you are their resource on issues related to sexual violence. And most staff will admit readily they are not experts, but they're looking to you for your input, your resources, your data, your perspective, and your real life stories of constituents. And so advocacy is education. It's about building strong relationships. Even if you disagree with your member of Congress, you can disagree, but that member of Congress and staff can still think of you as a issue expert and will go to you, and you want them to go to you as a resource. That's the goal of advocacy, that ongoing relationship. We all have ups and downs in relationships, just like we do with members of Congress and their staff. But it really is the best foundation to be an excellent advocate. So now here's the pragmatic. Members of Congress, even in times of many virtual meetings now, some, depending on where you live, this might, it might be okay to meet in person. You literally just are able to locate your member's district office. That will be the office closest to you by going to your member's website. And here are the links right on the PowerPoint. And the contact information for their offices will be online, usually under the contact information button. You literally can just pick up the phone and call your district office and literally say, I want to request a meeting with Congressman or Senator X, Y, and Z, and how best should I do that? Is there a portal? Do I need to submit an official letter, or can you direct me to the appropriate staff person? So most offices will request an email request or an official letter, but by picking up that phone and asking how to make that request is the very first step. When you're requesting your meeting, you are going to be requesting a meeting with the member of Congress, and we recommend you do so next week. We picked these weeks that we're targeting for our district level advocacy because it is a congressional recess, and so there won't be votes in Congress, so members of Congress are at home. So as soon as you pick up the phone and find out how you're going to make that request, the sooner the better. If you get a response back that the member is not available, but a staff person would be happy to meet with you, please do not feel defeated. The staff person is an excellent meeting. That's a member is very busy. The staff person who you'll likely be meeting with is that expert on and handles a portfolio of issues and is that key advisor to the member of Congress on issues related to violence against women. So I actually sometimes I often prefer meeting with staff, to be really honest, because they're in the weeds. That's their job. They want to be educated and they have the time to spend with you to learn more. If the scheduler doesn't connect you and you don't know the staffer who handles that issue, it is perfectly also fine to call back the district office and ask specifically what staffer would be the most appropriate to meet on issues related to sexual violence. Okay, once you have that meeting, what are you going to do? Here are some 4 key prep points. First, it's really important, like anything, before we want to do anything, we want to know what we're walking into, either in person or online. I recommend the best way to get to know your member, if you don't know he or she or his or her positions best, the best place to go is online to that member's website. Take time to peruse it. They all have an area on which they put forth their policy positions on a variety of issues. So get in your head where this person is coming from, and no joke, it's good to know if that what party that member is part of. We're going to go over your talking points, but when you're going to want to practice your message, so it's key, it's concentrated, direct, and you're going to keep on message. Also, Reliance has provided for you, and the links will be in the chat, all the policy 1-pagers and background, so you're going to be well versed on the policies and know what you're going to be asking for in a very direct manner. And please know, members of Congress and their staff know you're having a meeting to ask them to do something. They often are like, come on, what's the ask? So don't feel shy about asking. They know that's why you're having a meeting. and also be prepared in terms of understanding sort of what the big federal policy asks are and how that relates to you at home in the district with real life examples. So as we were saying, so when you're thinking about planning your meeting, once you have your scheduled event, think about who else you might want to invite to the meeting. You don't want 20 people in a meeting, but having key influencers, maybe leaders in your community or your staff and colleagues who are experts on the policies that you want to discuss are wonderful to include in your meeting. And even a survivor, if he or she is willing to do so, to get a real perspective of someone who has experienced sexual violence is really impactful if that works for you. And then when you have the folks you know who are going to be in the meeting, you want to think about what role they're going to play. Who's going to introduce? Who's going to say hello? Who's going to go through each point? Is everyone going to make an ask, or is one person going to make the ask? And who's going to follow up at the end? Ideally, everyone should have some sort of speaking role. If that works out for you, that is an ideal, but not everyone has to speak, but can be there as a resource as well. And then you're going to want to be all on the same page in terms of what you're going to be asking and who's going to say what. And once again, go in prepared and know who you're meeting with. And if there are any, what the current news is, you're going to want to know that and be excited about the American Rescue Plan and all the new money coming, the first COVID relief funding coming for survivors of sexual assault. And, you want to be up to speed on the American Rescue Plan and that you're excited about, for instance, the introduction of the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. Couple things to expect. Expect change, expect fluctuations. If you get a last minute call that the member of Congress you thought was going to be meeting with, all of a sudden he or she has a conflict and says they can't meet with you and a staffer will, that is totally normal. They are not being rude. They are very busy. Changes come up. Expect change and don't take it personally. Whoever you get that meeting with is your opportunity to educate, inform, and make the ask. Often a member will attend the meeting, say hello, want to be introduced to you all, learn a little bit about your organization, and then leave the meeting. So he or she might only come in for the beginning and then have to leave, and that staff person, once again, not very normal. It is not just because he or she doesn't want to meet with your group. And also we say that especially in DC, staff are very, very young. These are not high paid jobs, as just like many of you know very personally about. So the staff are young, hours are long, not well paid. So don't be surprised if staff are younger than you think, but they are there, they're excited, they want to learn. Most are really trying to do the best they can and are really excited to make relationships themselves because they need resources to be better at their job.
Okay, so you've read your issue briefs, you've gathered your influencers together, you've had a prep call or a prep Zoom, you've assigned a facilitator, you've got yourself organized. Now you're meeting with the member or their staff, you're ready to go, you're on your Zoom or your Google Meet or whatever the staff or it's always good to ask what their preferred platform is, because some folks have difficulty, like I've noticed a lot of people in the House and Senate have difficulty interfacing with Google Meet. So they may have a preference, they may prefer a teleconference. So you go with them and what works best for them. So some to-dos and some maybe stay away froms for conducting your meeting. Try to be concise and organized. It's easy. I mean, I know I feel this way when I'm talking about things. We're passionate. We want to get going. We want to tell a lot of stories. Those all are really important, but make sure sometimes you're just having a 30-minute meeting. Maybe you'll get an hour, but just know that you've kind of boxed in the different points you want to make and that you get to them. You want to make sure that you leave time to ask and answer questions. So you don't want to use up all the time. You want to make sure you save some time for them to ask questions and get them really engaged. Obviously, you want to know the issue and prepare. You want to know your build numbers if you have them, those sorts of things. And you are the expert. We want you to feel really empowered. You know this work better than anyone else. You do it every day, whether you're a prevention person, you're an activist, you're coming at this as a survivor, you are an advocate, you are the expert in your experience of this work. And so bring that expertise to the table. Don't be afraid to share personal stories, stories of clients and the prevention work. Those really make everything come alive. So as I said, stories sell. Don't forget to come up with a few anecdotes of your work. What has a survivor said? Obviously, you're going to keep information confidential, but what has a survivor said about your program that really just warms your heart because you knew you'd really help somebody? What did a kid say in a prevention group that was like, oh, now I understand the issue of consent? What's something that happened in your local community where you feel like the member of Congress really needs to understand better what the problem is of sexual violence in your community? Get those stories ready. Do get into some details and make sure we're going to talk at the end about some very specific asks. Again, Ellen said, don't be shy. They're expecting your asks. That's probably the most important part of your meeting, is to make sure that you make those specific asks. Talk about the fact that you're a constituent. Talk about the way you know your community, and be passionate. You want to stay calm and focused, but you also want to be passionate because you're an advocate and you're there for a reason. You do want to leave breaks for questions. Often staff will have follow-up questions for you, and that's great. Like if they're engaged in what you're saying and they want to say, okay, when you said this data point about 62% of programs have a waiting list for counseling, is that the same as therapy? That you want to give them time to ask those questions. Most of us are coming at this from a nonprofit place and not a C4 place. If you're meeting as an individual, you can do what you want, but certainly you should not bring election politics into these meetings. That won't help. Don't feel any pressure to answer a question if you don't know the answer. It's perfectly acceptable to say, I will get back with you. So don't feel awkward about that at all. I do that every day where I say, oh, I don't have the answer to that, but I will find the person that does. I will find the information and I will get back to you. And that gives you a reason to get back to them too, which is great. And then you want to leave with some clarity on next steps. So have I gotten Congresswoman XYZ to agree to supporting the Violence Against Women Act, those sorts of things? Could we talk again about coming to visit our program when it's safe to be out and about? Okay, and so concluding your meeting, you want to ask if there are any questions, obviously end on a positive note and express thanks. You can drop materials in the chat if you're doing a virtual meeting, for sure. You can also email them in advance, which is great. If you've been asked a question and you didn't know the answer, or the member of staff has asked for additional information, just reiterate, say, I heard you ask about data on how many survivors are in our community. I will follow up with you with a data report on that. Remind the official that you want to be a resource, and invite them again when it's safe to come to an event. If you're having a virtual event, if you're having a SAM event, to come and be part of that. So you always want to think of it as an ongoing relationship. It's the starting point. Most important part about it is relationship building, and what are other ways that you all can continue to interface. So it used to be we really put a premium on handwritten letters, snail mail letters. Obviously, emails are the way we do things a lot. So email is appropriate as a follow-up and thank you, but it is super important to follow up with thank you notes. You want to follow up with the materials that you promised. You want to follow up with information about any answers to questions they asked. You can follow up and participate in their local events or town halls or things that they're doing so you can be closer. Want to, put in your calendar, like reach out again to Congresswoman Torres and provide her with the our new report when it comes out, so that you make sure that you're pinging back to that person. Definitely use social media. We have a slide about that at the end and some resources on your members' social media handles. So it's great to tweet at them. Great meeting today with Senator Portman. We are really excited about your support for SASP, those sorts of things. I'm just making up these examples, as you can imagine, but maybe you're going to turn them into real stories. So I'm going to turn it back to Ellen to talk about a few high-level talking points. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the asks.
Thanks, Terry. Okay. So now when you're thinking about framing your conversation, I want to reiterate something Terry just said a moment ago, which I find really helpful, especially in these virtual um, times. Sending supporting materials by email, like fact sheets and information about your program before your meeting, is really helpful. It helps staff get centered. It helps staff prep their boss if a member is going to attend. So you sort of start on a somewhat educated playing field. And then sometimes you send the materials and they don't have time to prep, but it is good to send materials ahead of time if you can. While you're gonna talk about specifics and data, which is really important, and facts, what also, staff and members of Congress every day, all day are hearing data and facts and evidence and research about hundreds of different issues. So to really connect to them and to try and make it personal, also think about specific stories, anecdotes, what's going on in your community. One of the best things that a staffer ever said to me when he was being really honest, he's like, I got to tell you, if I can give my boss one or two stories that he's going to remember, your issue will be with him for life. So the facts and your asks, but your personal stories are very important, and relating it to the community in which you live and where this member of Congress is representing. All politics is local. Okay, so we are talking about gaps in funding and resources that the federal government can help us as program providers or advocates need to do our jobs better and serve survivors and prevent violence. So we want to make sure that the staff and the member of Congress sort of knows where the gaps are. The data we can, according the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence does annual surveys, so we are prepared when we go up to Congress and explain why we need an increase in funding. We relate it directly back to the national need, which we receive from all the state coalitions, that information and data, which I know they reached out to ask you about. It is critical to our advocacy efforts. Also, talking about prevention, the impact, obviously, of COVID, top of mind. Members of Congress have appropriated over the past two Congresses trillions of dollars down to the local level for a variety of programs. Where are the gaps? How has that helped? We just got our first funding for sexual assault. You won't be able to speak to how it's going to help in the next couple of weeks, but you sure are happy and joyful and relieved this money is coming, because you can talk about the great need and the impact COVID has done on the clients and people you are trying to serve. And also, talking about prevention is also critical while we're in a great time of need. But of course, we want to prevent the need from ever happening. And I'm sorry to say, I think we all have another high-profile case in the news with the governor of New York right now being accused of sexual harassment. So that is, once again, it's in the news and everyone's looking at it, talking about it, and that's going to probably, most likely, impact survivors coming to your programs for services. So once you're laying the groundwork and the need, then you go into speak specifically about the federally funded programs that exist and that help you do your work. And that's where you're going to talk about VAWAS, SAS, VOCA, RPE. And then that's where you also talk about there's still so much unmet need out there right now. And that's why we need the federal government to increase its support to fill these gaps. And that, always making sure the staff and member need that the demand for services far outweigh your local, state, and federal resources. But they really have to understand this in numbers, examples, stories. So because they're not doing the job you do day in and day out, it's really important they have this mix of, as I said, stories, facts, and data. And then once you have prepped and talked about all the why you need the continued services, and that's when you can go into specifically explaining what programs VOCA is helping you provide and how the potential cuts and real cuts happening in your states and community, how that's impacting your work, and how you receive or use the SAS funding and RPE. So it all comes together when you're sort of explaining the need, explaining the impact of COVID, explaining the lack of resources, how why you need more resources, and what specifically these federal dollars are doing. I mean, I have to say, you know, any responsible lawmaker wants to know and understand the impact of the money they are sending out and appropriated, because at the end of the day, we might all have different thoughts of how to impact policy, but the common denominator is that elected officials are trying to impact policy in a positive way to meet the needs of constituents. And your job is to make sure they understand the needs of the people you are serving.
Great, Ellen. Thank you so much. And you know, just we're getting to the end of our information to share, getting ready to open it for questions. Just a couple other points to make, which is that bringing it home for them about how many survivors you serve, whether or not you have a waiting list. And we know the difficulty with numbers. Believe me, we do this at a national level, so it's hard to quantify what we do. But whatever you have, share. Are you seeing increases? Are you seeing demand? What does it look like? I can tell you from being in so many meetings, you really see people start to take their notes when you're getting at the, how does this affect my community? The demand is increasing. Here are the major things that we're seeing, and making that really fit your community. I know I've heard Iowans talk about the impact of sexual violence in the meat packing plant. So what does that look like? Bringing home like the really specific realities and the data points. So you have told your stories, you have shared your data points, you've let everyone say something, you've left room for questions, but you do want to make sure that you leave with your specific ask. So towards the end of the meeting, you want to say, is Representative so-and-so, is Senator so-and-so willing to support? And here are the things that we suggest as your specific asks. If you have things that are a top priority for your community, you obviously can include those too. These are the issues that we have fact sheets about, that we're all working on together at the federal level, but you might also have state and local policies that you want to ask about, which is awesome. But our asks, our suggested asks are to co-sponsor and support the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act with key enhancements and no rollbacks. That's very important because we're looking for more support, more to go farther around tribal sovereignty, for the ability of tribes to prosecute non-native offenders on tribal lands. We're wanting to make sure the non-discrimination provisions in VAWA that protect LGBTQ survivors stay really strong. And so we need to talk about the importance of key enhancements and no rollback. So co-sponsor and support the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Then we're asking for $100 million for the Sexual Assault Services Program at the Office on Violence Against Women. They often want to know, where does this federal program sit? And if you say on the Office on Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice, then they understand which part of the budget that fits in. Then we want steady funding for the Crime Victims Fund at DOJ. We also want VOCA funding for tribes, and we want to ask them to co-sponsor and support the VOCA Fix Act, which is HR 1652 in the House and S 611 in the Senate, to increase deposits, and certainly talk about, if you're experiencing VOCA cuts, what that looks like. That's how you really bring this one home. And then how we want to increase funds to $75 million for the rape prevention and education program, and we want to make sure to fund the involvement of the coalitions to bring that expertise in sexual violence prevention to our communities. So those are the specific asks. And then you'll definitely want to share, and Maureen's going to drop in the chat some information about how you find your members' Twitter handles and your senators. Great to share that. Great to you could consider taking a Zoom picture and asking. You have to get permission for posting pictures, but you might consider taking a Zoom picture and seeing if you can post it. Certainly can use graphics from your center, but really great to follow up on social media. Really important part of the work. So that's really the heart of the presentation. I'm going to stop my screen sharing in just a second. And I don't know how I got these orange annotations, but they kind of kept things lively, I think. But that's, and you can feel free to reach me, tpoor@reliance.org for questions, but we also have time for questions now. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing. Get to see your faces.
Hey,
Some of
Carrie, it's Maureen. There were a couple questions in the chat, and which some Ellen and Monica were responding to, which is great, but there were a couple about related to lobbying. So I wonder if you could address that real quick, like how nonprofits that are funded by VOCA, for example, lobbying for the bills without risk losing your federal funding. And just basically, the question is directly contacting your member of Congress considered lobbying versus advocacy.
Thank you, Maureen. So important. And I'm going to try to, if I can grab a minute to grab some Boulder advocacy links to drop in the chat. But we did a really great webinar last year with Boulder advocacy. The good news is there's a lot you can do. Nonprofits can advocate, they can lobby. You just can't do it with your federal funding. So if you were doing this as a 501c3, you just can use a certain percentage of your budget towards lobbying. You can do it with unrestricted funds. So you can do that lobbying. If you're entirely federally funded as a 501c3 and you feel like, I don't feel comfortable bridging that gap, so anything with a specific ask, then what you can do, we really harped on the importance of the ask, but you can always take that ask part out, and then you are completely able as a 501c3 to educate your members of Congress and senators. So talk to them about your program, leave the ask out, tell them what you do, educate them, those sorts of things. The other thing you can do is you can always do this in your own time too. So you can take leave from your job and you can go as a private citizen. I happen to be the executive director of XYZ program, but I'm on my personal time now. And I just want to talk to you about what survivors need in our community. So those are some options. I just want to really, for you to feel empowered that there are many ways to go about this. And the other thing is you can help educate people in your community that are outside of the 501c3 that are survivors who want to be more involved. They can carry your message. So there's lots of ways to get at this, to really be bolder in your advocacy, bring those messages to your members of Congress.
Just a follow-up question about whether board members can lobby on behalf of VOCA-funded nonprofits.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Bring your board members in their personal time to talk about those issues. Absolutely. That's a great idea. You should be involving board members in this, especially if you've got a board member who's an influential part of your community. You should be bringing them to these meetings anyway, for absolutely sure. That's a great idea.
There's also a new question about a request for a future webinar about nonprofits getting access to any of this funding. It seems inaccessible. Prevention funding goes to counties and it seems to stop there. And there was an earlier question, I think also from Jeremy about that. How does the RPE and education funding get down to community groups, that it's hard when it's already going to well-established larger groups?
We understand that as a struggle. And I think that's where some administrative advocacy comes in. At the state level, you can definitely need to build. So all that money comes through your state, through, SASP and VOCA funds come often through Attorney General's office, but legal affairs different. You might have a crime victim services office. RPE usually comes through the health department. And we know there are issues with this. And we really understand that. But building, just like you're building relationships with members of Congress, building those relationships with your state administrators can be really vital. I also want to say sometimes as we talk about these federal funding sources like Sexual Assault Services Program, RPE, sometimes I know, as I came from a local program, you're getting 4 or 5 different funding sources all together that fund your position. And it might be called something different, right? So sometimes that can be tricky to know which exact funding source it is. But I do think one of the things I'm excited about is this relief funding and the culture specific funding, because it's more money really being promising for getting out to the community, but you raise really important issues and we always have a way to go as advocates at the national level to make sure that money gets where it needs to go. So thank you for raising that issue.
And Terry, I was going to back you up. I too am feeling optimistic about this new relief funding. We might take 24 hours to catch our breath, but come Monday, our next step, now that this is a law, we will be doing our administrative advocacy, going to the FIPSA office, which is located at the Department of Health and Human Services, and say, okay, we are here, we need to get this money out. And I do believe much of that money is going to go directly to local programs, but we have to help them and be the experts and making sure that it's going to get to programs that don't maybe normally get it, that there's money for TA. So smaller programs that don't have professional grant writers are going to have access to this money. And that especially, and I co-sign what Terry said about the culturally specific programs. That's something our allies lobbied hard to make sure the language in the bill was specific to that. Services were going to go to culturally specific populations through culturally specific organizations. So we've got our second round of work to do. But I'm cautiously optimistic about getting this new money out to programs that don't often receive it.
Yes, I want to, and I totally appreciate echoing several things in the chat, especially for our local direct service providers. Most of the staff who work for your members of Congress in district live, work, and play in your district. So that's something to remember for those of you who may be members of your local interagency councils or have relationships where your Chamber of Commerce, those are places that you're always going to see the staff who work in district that represent your member of Congress. I certainly, again, I work in North Carolina, so we've been getting feedback from our local programs who were very excited to get back from their local district offices from their members of Congress who have not traditionally supported the VOCA fixed. And so it was a huge success for our local program. And they actually, and I think it was Pat Roos who said this in the chat, have started to develop a long-term relationship with the staff. And so that is also important to remember, is the district staff are there when members of Congress are back in DC. So they certainly are really good support systems for you because they live in your communities.
We also have a question about where we can find further information on the Relief Act, the American Relief American Rescue Plan. What's the best way to get a summary out to people or direct them?
And I don't know
I'll
if folks
put
are
it-
interested in overall, we might need to share an overall summary and then also a summary of the survivor funding. Can you do that, Ellen?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to share a link to the overall summary.
There's a lot in there, a lot of stuff.
It's a lot. This link I just put in is a great link to each section. State and local funds, transportation funds, child nutrition, child care, so that is a good summary that I just put in. And then maybe Terry, yes, in terms of the specific details of the specific survivor funds, we can put together something.
Yeah, I just dropped a link in the chat that has a release that has at least the numbers, so that were in the slide. We'll also have a recording of this webinar available. Were there any other questions or themes that we missed in the chat? And also, we've got just a couple minutes left if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question or bring something into the room. We so appreciate everyone using the chat and joining us today too. We hope you feel well equipped to ring up your member of Congress and say, let's have a Zoom meeting the first week of April. Find the right staff. Once you find the right staff person who covers these issues, once you've got an email, you have gold, because anytime you have something come up, you can send that person an email, build a relationship with staff that can be so valuable. So we really encourage you to jump in there. Also, reach out if you've got questions. The other thing I've found is that sometimes we talk about all this stuff, and I know somebody's got this question of like, well, how does that piece really work? And every time somebody asks us one of those questions, it helps me so much understand how to talk about these issues, because it's like, oh yeah, we skipped right over that part, that important piece. So please feel free to reach out with specific questions. We're also glad to jump on a call and help you prep for a meeting or help talk about how to find the right staffer. So please use us as a resource. And thank you so much for being part of this Reliance event. Thank you so much for the work that you do every day on behalf of survivors and prevention. There is a recording. I'm about to stop it and it will be sent out and shared. It will be on the Reliance website. So the reliance.org/policy is where all this stuff is. The toolkit, the recording will be there as soon as we have it. All the handouts, the templates are all on that page. So thank you so much, everybody. It was really great to have you on today. And I am just amazed that we did it in an hour. Thank you. Good luck. Get the toolkit, make your meetings, empower yourself. You are who you need. You are who survivors need. You are who our communities need to prevent sexual violence. Go out there and speak truth to power. Take care, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
I just had a question.
Oh, okay.
I was just wondering if there's a certificate for this. Oh, somebody answered it. I'm not okay. But this is really a good session you guys did. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry we're not able to offer a certificate, but thank you so much for being
I uploaded the information, so I'm gonna go ahead and read those. Thank you, ladies. Nice meeting you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our interpreters and our closed captioners, and we wish everyone well. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording.